This could be a scene on the railroad in any small town in North America during the first half of the last century, but I was born too late for that. I found a way to travel back in time. I'm standing in Qiqihar in far northeastern China, and the year is 1986. I'm 25 days into a 5-week wander through the People's Republic of China. I've been obsessed with the steam locomotive from an early age. My parents are to blame for this. They dressed me funny and took me on the many steam excursions that ran around Chicago. Damage done, fast forward to 1986. I've just graduated with a transportation degree from Western Illinois University. Mom started working for United Airlines several years before, and the airline offered one standby pass per year, good for 60 days to offspring still in college. Stunned that I had actually made it through, she graciously provided such a pass and $1,000 as a graduation present. I immediately spent $100 of it on film. Very little information existed about China at the time. Up until very recently, tourists could only visit on organized tours. I found a book by the well-known journalist William Middleton titled China by Rail. Mr. Middleton graciously spoke to me on the phone about what I would find in China. A family friend who had studied Chinese and had recently been traveling there gave me a Chinese phrase book and plenty of advice. From the two of them, I hopefully gained enough facts to successfully navigate a short trip in China. A short trip is what was planned. After all, I only had $900 to spend. When it is gone, it will be time to head home. There were several options to travel between Hong Kong over the border to Guangzhou. I chose the overnight ferry boat. Yep, the proverbial slow boat to China. When the boat arrived the next morning, it took a long time to get through customs. It was hot, and being thirsty, I asked for a glass of water at a nearby restaurant. I was surprised to receive a boiling hot glass of water. Then a visit to the market. Yeah, I won't be eating that. Or that. Definitely not that. China only permitted foreigners to carry what was called foreign exchange currency, also known as FEC. To buy anything in China, foreigners must legally use this currency. The local currency is called renminbi. There was a black market for FEC, as many foreign-produced goods such as TVs and other appliances could only be bought with FEC. FEC could be exchanged for renminbi with shady money changers on the street at 20% over value. Another headache was double pricing. For every transaction, there was a special foreigner's price that could be 5 times more than the cost for locals. The challenge of the trip became to pay the Chinese people's price with the Chinese people's money. The next day it was trackside to meet some of China's diesels. It was bewildering to see so many pedestrians on the right-of-way. I discovered that many residences were only accessible from the railway. Wandering into the coachyard, which would be the first place in China I got tossed out of, I found Romanian-built ND2 class and Chinese-built DF4 class diesels. However, this was the only steam locomotive to be found. Later at the depot, I learned that lines are called queues in the rest of the English-speaking world. In China, well, I really know little about the Chinese language, but I'm sure they have no word for it at all. There doesn't seem to be any respect for your place in a line or queue. To get to the ticket window at the train station, I discovered you actually had to be very forceful to get there. Even once I was in front of the window, I had to use elbows to keep people from pushing me out of the way. Of course, after forcing my way to the window, I learned that train tickets for foreigners were only available at a special office a few blocks away. I didn't have a plan for my next move, but it seemed to make sense to head west for Kunming. Other travelers had recommended a stop in Guilin. I decided to follow that advice. That night from the train, I woke up at a station stop and saw my first steam engine simmering in the dark. I still remember how good it smelled. The next day, as we proceeded to Guilin, they were everywhere. There were two types of steam locomotives common in China. Several classes of Chinese-built Mikado 282s based on a U.S. Elco design, and Chinese-built QJ Class 210-2s based on a Russian design which was derived from the German Class 42 Kriegslok 210-0. The next day, I rented a bike and wandered. That afternoon, the railroad would not sell foreigners space on that evening's train, but I found a nicely dressed Chinese man in front of the depot who offered to buy a ticket for me. That night, I boarded a train for Kunming. There was very little steam here in the southwest, and electrification construction was evident. Power here was mostly Chinese-built DF and DF3 class diesels, which were copies from a Russian design, which in turn were copies from a U.S. Fairbanks-Morse design. On arrival in Guilin, it was announced the train would be terminated there. A railroad representative herded all the foreigners into the first-class lounge and informed us that due to a landslide, the line would be closed for several days. They were putting the Chinese people on buses, but that was not an option for foreigners. The option given was to travel by train on a circuitous route that would take 3 days. This didn't sound like a good option. Another traveler, David from Iowa, who had studied Chinese, didn't like that option either. We decided it would be a good idea to wait in Guilin for the line to open. We tried but could not find a hotel that would allow foreigners to stay in their establishment. We sat in a cafe to figure out the next move, and I spent some time studying the timetable. The local train section of the timetable was especially hard to read as it was completely in Chinese script. As I figured, there were local trains that operated on the line. These trains must be running at least as far as they could. Then we could get around the slide somehow and continue by train on the other side. Back at the depot we found this was true, and they sold us hard sleeper space on an all-stop local train to Lipanshui that was leaving in just a few hours. The next morning we got off the train and hiked a short distance to the edge of town and attempted to hitchhike. There wasn't a lot of traffic, and the second vehicle to show up just happened to be the police. David explained what we were trying to do, and they agreed to help us by flagging down the next vehicle. Getting rid of us was easier than dealing with us. The next vehicle just happened to be a bus going part of our way. We bounced along slowly on windy, bumpy dirt mountain road for about 4 hours until we arrived at the next town. I suppose foreigners had never been seen in town before, and it was only moments before a crowd of several hundred people surrounded us, mouths open and staring. The bus we needed to continue on only ran once a day, and we had already missed today's departure, so we attempted hitchhiking again. We got lucky and got a ride quickly in a crew cab style pickup with several guys that were making a run into Kunming for supplies for their unit. Again we bounced along for hours on a dirt mountain road. They let us off just outside of Zhanwei. We still had several miles to go and finish the trip in an ox cart. David chatted with the cart's owner as we traveled. When we got out, I asked David what they were talking about. He told me he didn't know. He didn't understand his dialect. We found sparse accommodation that night and showed up early the next morning for our ride to Kunming. A few days later, I found myself at the Kunming North Station, where the French-built meter-gauge railroad to Vietnam originates. However, because of a war with Vietnam in 1979, the line only went as far as the border. They had completely dieselized in the late 70s, but the rusting remains of the consolidations were still on the property. I returned the next day to go for a ride. I wanted to make it to the southern end to see a 60 centimeter gauge railroad that still used steam, but I was informed that foreigners were not permitted. I purchased a ticket as far south as they would allow, about 4 hours from Kunming. It was a spectacular ride over the line that was opened in 1910. I was also treated to a varied and excellent meal in the dining car. The following day, it was north to Chengdu, the capital of the Sichuan province, on a much-anticipated ride across the Daliang Mountains over a line regarded as an engineering marvel. By now, I'd started getting the hang of buying train tickets. Most of the time, ticket counters would be reluctant to sell tickets to foreigners. When they would, it would be for a train several days out, and they would require payment in FEC at the inflated price for foreigners. I discovered that if you just got on the train, you could buy a ticket on board with renminbi at the locals' price, an exponential savings. The train was jam-packed and I started out in the hard seat section on the aisle with my butt barely able to find room on the bench seat. It was difficult to get to the window, so I don't have many pictures of the run. Even when I could, for much of the trip, the train was inside a tunnel. Babies in China don't wear diapers, having crotchless pants instead. There was a baby sitting on a woman's lap across the aisle from me. She was on the edge of the seat as well. Periodically, the little boy would let out a squeal, lean back, and let it rip right into the aisle and down Mom's leg. After dodging baby pee for the 4th time, I decided to try and get space in the sleeper. The next morning, Train 94 arrived in Chengdu, once again in a region with operating steam. I got off the train to a wonderful surprise, a genuine Pacific-type locomotive under steam. After finding a hotel, I hiked along the tracks until discovering multiple Mikados switching in a yard. I'd never witnessed anything like it. I'm back in time. The weather was really drab, so I took a few shots, but not wanting to waste my limited supply of film, I just sat and watched. 20 minutes later, 2 policemen rode up on their bicycles. They were very polite. Out came the phrase book and we spent a long time passing it back and forth. They assured me I wasn't in trouble, but they seemed to want something. They made gestures with their hands that looked a lot like removing film from a camera and pointing to mine. I just didn't understand. Eventually they gave up and had me follow them to a shacky-looking office nearby. A portly gentleman sat at a desk and they sat me down across from him. The 4 of us spent more time passing the phrase book and then more gestures that I just didn't understand. Soon the man at the desk got on the phone and after a while handed it to me. "Can I help you?" said a voice in broken English. No, I'm okay," I replied. He said some more stuff, but his English was so bad that I truly couldn't understand. He asked me to hand the phone back to the man at the desk. They spoke for a few minutes. The man hung up the phone and proceeded filling up both sides of 2 pages of a mini notebook with Chinese script. He handed me the pages and pointed to the door. It was time to head east, first by rail to Chongqing, then by boat down the Yangtze to Wuhan. We passed a SL Class Pacific, then at a stop along the way, I ran for a shot of this GJ Class tank engine. When I got back to the train, I was told that my fellow passengers thought I was trying to escape. Arriving in Beijing on June 22nd, I was getting weary of the hardships of China travel. Every transaction for food and lodging was a fight, and generally, the Chinese people weren't very nice to foreigners. But there was one other thing I had to do. I figured I'd do that thing and continue on to the other countries on my airline pass. However, other travelers mentioned an easy side trip from Beijing to the Qing Dynasty's summer palace in the mountain resort town of Chengdu. I assessed my finances and realized that to date I had only spent about $200 since entering the country. That one other thing could wait. I decided to go to Chengdu first. I rented a bicycle and started exploring. After visiting the Imperial Palace, I heard a whistle echoing from far down the valley. I rode the bike over to a perch and waited. Around the curve came a steam-hauled passenger train. I had been told that there were no longer any steam-hauled passenger trains in China. I had seen plenty of steam in the past 3 weeks, but none on passenger trains. I hauled out my timetable and figured out that this train would turn around shortly and return to where it had come from, Longhua. I rode as fast as I could back to the train station in Chengdu and purchased a ticket. While waiting for the train to turn to go back to Chengdu, railway workers poured me a glass of boiling water and insisted they pose me for a photo. Too bad he didn't know how to focus the camera. When the train returned to Chengdu, I discovered the steam-powered passenger train wasn't an anomaly. A QJ210-2 was about to depart with an overnight train. This changes everything. That one thing I had left to do was going to have to wait. That night, I worked out a plan. Hop the express to Beijing and get off at the first stop. A few hours later, a local back towards Chengdu to catch that overnight train with steam. I will ride that train overnight to, crisscross Lincoln's Hat. There, I can connect to another train and go to this place. With a 4.5-hour layover at Dongyangho, I hiked out of town a ways, climbed a hill, and waited for trains, the whole time dodging beetles the size of my fist. I slept that night with my head by the open window in a sleeper second behind the QJ. A change of trains at 6 a.m. and a big surprise. The next train rolled in with an RM-class Pacific in command. Now I was riding a non-existent steam-powered passenger train behind a non-existent Pacific. The train arrived at Zinletun. I hopped off, took a right to get a picture of the Pacific, and was immediately surrounded by the police with their arms outstretched. Out came my phrasebook, letter of introduction, and timetable. I really didn't have a plan for my next move, but I guess I was leaving. I pointed to the next train north in the timetable. They were actually accommodating. I was escorted for about an hour and allowed to take these pictures. When my escort had had enough, we went across the street for lunch, and then I was locked up in an office for several hours until the train I pointed to in the timetable arrived. This was the easiest to acquire train ticket of the trip. I chose Tongliao as a destination because I would arrive at around 8 p.m. I figured I'd find a hotel and get started again in the morning. When I got off, however, I got another police reception. I picked the next northbound in the timetable, pointed, and got locked up again until the train arrived at 2 a.m. That train arrived in Qiqihar around 10 a.m. Exhausted, I found a hotel and got some sleep. The next morning I went to the depot early for a 1 o'clock train to Harbin and waited in the rain. I have spent a month in China, but there's still one more thing I had to do. It took 2 nights and 2 trains via Beijing to get to Datong. I never imagined that I'd ever visit a steam locomotive factory. This is the Datong Locomotive Works, the last factory anywhere dedicated to building steam locomotives. So far this trip, I managed to avoid the insanity of dealing with the Chinese International Travel Service. I set up the tour the day before. I had to hire an interpreter guide and a car with a driver. They also told me I was required to purchase a cheesy-looking souvenir certificate of my tour. This whole package was going to cost the equivalent of $75. I know that doesn't sound like a lot for such a unique experience, but in perspective, I'd been traveling for over a month in China, covered thousands of miles, and spent less than $300. I was told to meet them in the lobby of my hotel the next morning. When I arrived, there was a small crowd waiting. There were 3 other individuals and a family of 4, all who were required to separately hire their own guides and drivers. Though most of China's QJ-class 210-2s were built here, at the time of my visit they were building JS-class Mikados. It was a tremendous experience being on such hallowed ground. The factory would build its last steam locomotive in December 1988. I took as many pictures as I could, though my guide was impatiently pressing me to keep up with the rest of the tour. The tour finished up with a short ride and a photo op. Ah, that new locomotive smell. Back in the factory office, they started talking up the nifty, cheesy souvenir I was forced to buy. I noticed a pile of replica builder's plates gathering dust in a corner. I told them I'd really like to buy one of those too. That can be your souvenir, they told me. After the tour, I spent the afternoon trackside in Datong. The following day, I took a train to Beijing and flew out on July 8th. I had spent 34 days and traveled nearly 7,000 miles, 6,000 by rail, 800 of which behind steam. The total cost, $375. But the trip wasn't over. I still had money and 3 weeks left on my standby pass. I would visit New Zealand and Australia, getting home to Chicago on the 59th day of my 60-day pass with $20 in my pocket.